Hello, all, and welcome to the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Fanatics podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Coolbaugh. Today, I have me a very special guest, Scott Drakeford. Scott, how are you doing today?
Doing great, man. How are you?
Oh, excellent, excellent. I was really glad I could get you on the first minute. First time I saw your cover pass on Twitter, I was like, "Yep, follow that person. Check the blurb." And I was like, added it to Goodreads right away. Went on to Tor. Yeah, got the whole kit and caboodle, and I was like, I think I messaged you like right after I had seen your profile. So that's all why I'm always on Twitter, is because I have so many friends that share, great authors and books. So I'm very thankful for them, and I'm very thankful that you could come on today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. Book Twitter is fantastic, and I'm glad that Tor's work on the cover and the blurb worked for you.
Yeah, it's just like classic. My friend had actually just got your book, and I think it's in the mail. But yeah, he was like, oh, he said the same thing, and I like how he put it. And he said, oh, it's like kind of like classical fantasy, cover. But yeah, as soon as I read the blurb, I sent it to him. He's like, yeah, I already ordered that. Like, it's on the way. So yeah, it's worked for more people than just myself. So I hope more and more people feel the same way. Um, for that first question, so what has your writing journey been like up until this point?
Oh, sheesh. I have been known to take a very long time answering this question.
Oh, that's fine. We got all day.
So
I have nothing to do later but more work. I'd rather
yeah,
do
okay.
this. So
All right. So I'll start kind of from the beginning, and I might ruin some follow-up questions along the way,
that's
but
fine.
so basically, I grew up reading fantasy in particular, because my dad is really into reading. He reads a ton, and he's always liked fantasy as well. I guess I don't really know why. I should probably ask him how he got into it. But I grew up reading a ton for probably the same reasons a lot of us do. And then I was in college studying to get a mechanical engineering degree. I I really hated it. Found out about halfway through my degree, that I really didn't want to do it, but I pushed forward anyway because it was the quickest path to graduation and a decent income. Right around when I graduated, I was pretty sick of my engineering job already that I had done through school. And I decided I wanted to do something a little more creative. Engineering, I think my biggest gripe was that it wasn't nearly as creative as I wanted it to be. I went in with this idea of like, oh, I'm going to get to create all this awesome stuff and build some cool machines and whatever. And that just wasn't the case.
Yeah.
So yeah, I started writing in 2012, right after I graduated, and that was the beginning of this book of Rise of the Mages. I wrote just in spare time after work and at night. At that time, I didn't have a kid, but I was married. So I tried to carve out an hour or two every night of writing, and by 2013, around 2013 2014, I had a completed draft. But in October of 2013, I decided that I wanted to try the traditional publishing route. I went to a world fantasy convention in Brighton, England, partially because my wife and we were fairly newly married, 3 years married at that point. She has family in England that she wanted me to meet, and because I figured, if there are any agents that I wanted to try to meet, that I would have an advantage because I would be probably one of relatively few Americans there in England. And it worked, at least as much as it was ever going to work. I met two of my target agents, Joshua Bilmez, and my agent that I ended up querying and signing with, Matt Bialer. I liked both of them and a few others besides, a lot based on what I could look up online. But Matt in particular was very kind. Took a minute to talk to me after a Patrick Rothfuss reading and gave me his card. And so I ended up querying him first in 2015. So it took me like another year and a half or something to edit and rewrite, because there were, I mean, you and I talked about it a little bit before we went live, but like the process, especially for me, at least early on in the writing journey, it was a huge, it was just a self-learning exercise, you know, like as I drafted that first book, I would change so much as I went, both because the story was changing in my mind and trying to form itself, and because I was learning things all the time. You know, I was listening to writing excuses that was big at the time. I was reading every book on writing and editing that I could find. And I was changing myself as a writer. So I would keep a running list of all the things that I needed to go back and rewrite and edit. And it ended up being like 20 to 30 pages of, of notes of things I needed to change. So anyway, it was a massive effort. You know, a lot of people probably wisely write a book or a few books and move on and chalk them up to learning experiences. I was too stubborn to do that. So I just, and the story meant something to me. So I wanted to see it become, you know, as good as I had envisioned it. So I just kept going, kept editing, kept rewriting, you know, giving it to my wife, my brothers, my dad, any friends that would read it, and it kept editing based on feedback. And then I finally queried Matt Bialer in 2015. I got lucky and signed with him that year. I did some further edits and revisions with him and his assistants, which was fantastic. And one of the reasons that I wanted Matt as an agent, because I knew that he was very editorial, and at least had those capabilities. I don't know if he does that with every client, but he was willing to do so with me, and it was fantastic. In 2016, I want to say, we submitted to publishers. Matt had a list of, I think, 9 of the, you know, the big houses that he had contacts at. We sent out to those 9. We got 4 no's. 3 of the 4 no's came, which was awful. Like I was convinced I was never going to get a deal and that my writing career was over, you know, in 2016. And at that time, 4 years felt like a long time to have been doing it with, you know, not having seen anything. I guess, you know, I signed with an agent. That was big, but I was getting impatient, right? But 3 of the no's came back with really nice notes of, hey, I think this has a lot of merit and this is good, and here are the good things about it, but here's why I'm passing it. And we took those reasons from those 3. We pulled the submission from the 5 that hadn't responded yet, and told them we were going to do some edits based on some early feedback. And so I did that. I think I took 6 months or so to do that. That was a pretty substantial edit as well. Yeah. Because I went through, and I thought I had done a pretty good job of this, but I went through and took the manuscript from like 175,000 words down to around 130,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, without cutting any scenes. That was just purely rewording, rewriting scenes. Wow. To be as efficient as possible. And honestly, I went too far with it. Later on, after I signed with Tor, I ended up putting in a lot more, and it ended up at around 155, I think. So kind of smack dab in the middle. But that was a huge learning experience for me, because I thought I had done that thing. I don't remember the percentage that, you know, Sanderson and all those folks that actually know what they're doing say you should cut, whether it's 10 or 20 or something. But I just went as hard as I could at rewriting every scene, every sentence, everything to be as efficient as possible. And that did the trick. We signed with Tor in 2017. And we were supposed to have, I signed for a trilogy. We were supposed to have all 3 books come out right next to each other, At the end, I think it was the end of 2019 we were slated for, which in hindsight would have been really nice to
Yeah.
come in before the,
Yeah, seriously.
before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Um, but I had only written the first book, and I had become very obsessive with the first book, and that's kind of just part of my nature. But I just have a hard time letting go of my work, and I want it to be as perfect as possible. And it's very hard, even as I'm drafting other books, to not go back to a book after I've been like, oh, maybe I should do this a little different. Um, so long story short, I had a lot of stuff going on at work. I had a kid and stuff all in that same time period. Um, so I just couldn't do it. I couldn't get all three written by 2019, and then the pandemic hit and Tor had to shuffle their schedules.
Yeah.
So so I went from that kind of accelerated trade paperback kind of setup to a more traditional hardcover, one a year schedule. And even then, we moved the book to 2020, and then the pandemic hit, and I moved to 2021 to give them a little more room with some of their titles they had already planned and
Yeah.
all that. But then it moved again to early 2022, which was fine at that point, because it was like late 2021 to early 2022. But yeah, so the writing journey has been a very long one for me. At least, I don't know. I guess I shouldn't say that, because I think a lot of people, honestly, a lot of writers take about that long to
Oh,
get
sure.
to, to get their stuff to market, and
Yeah, yeah.
to to build themselves, however it happens. Um, but yeah, I nearly a decade of working on one book or one series has been a lot, but it's also been fantastic because so I've got book 2 done, and I'm revising right now, and will hopefully have it back to my editor again in not too long. Um, but those 9 or 10 years, I had to grow as a writer and to be working with a whole bunch of different professionals in the industry, and to write a second book even before book 1
Yeah.
had to be finalized. It gave me a lot of time to go back and do even more edits and more edits. I think I frustrated my editor, Jen, quite a bit with how much I kept wanting to change, just because again, I'm just a little bit obsessive about it. But it worked out, and I'm really, really happy with how the book turned out in the end. And it gave me a lot of opportunities to make sure it was exactly how I wanted it.
I feel like you brought up like a lot of great things, but one in particular is like that, because I think every time I go to make one of those really big changes, maybe not everyone, but like certain changes, I like literally take like a week break and then do something else to decide like, is that really what needs to happen? But I think a lot of people feel the same way that you do. It's like, is it too much changing? But everybody says the same thing, that they change, they change, they change. And I've talked to a lot of people recently who've just released books, and they say the same thing. They're like, oh, I don't know if I should have done that. And then a lot of them end up doing really well. So like, oh, I'm actually really glad I didn't edit it for a 100 billionth time and just left it at 99. So yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely can relate to that. I think a lot of writers can, because I don't think you ever. I think Steve McHugh actually said it recently on his Twitter, because he has a new one releasing, and somebody had asked a question, and he had made that comment. He's like, I don't think I'm ever ready to publish, and I
Yep.
definitely understand that. So yeah, I can definitely understand that feeling.
Yeah. At some point, you really just have to kind of let it loose and see what happens. It's both a blessing and a curse to have that leeway, because you do end up coming back to it, whether it's a good idea or not. And I think in my case, everything that happened was good. Uh, but it totally slowed me down on the rest of the trilogy.
Sure.
Um, and I'd say that's what takes me the most time in my writing process. It's not that I actually write slowly once I get into writing, it's that decision process and the doubt that comes along
Mm,
with having a list of things that could change and you don't know if they should change.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, trying to decide on what direction to go with a character or a plot or whatever else it might be, that kind of internal decision making process and deliberation is by far what takes me the longest, because I hate writing and then throwing it away, and I do it all the time anyway. But I hate throwing stuff away, so it's probably something I need to work through. But I'll deliberate and deliberate until I feel good about something, and then I do it instead of working my way through it, which is probably what I should do more of.
Well, when you figure out that skill, you let me know because like I know so the audience knows by now about my stupid character that was a constable, and then I thought he was gonna be like a rich constable, and now all of a sudden he decided he wanted to be a lowly thief taker on his family's last dime who needs to solve this case or else. And I'm
Yeah.
like, man, everybody I talked to about it when I like displayed the two were like, oh, that one sounds way cooler. And then especially with the repercussions in the story. But I think right now I'm like 2 months out still from that decision because I made it, but then it's like I still haven't quite figured out how to change everything else. So I've been changing a few other things. So I definitely understand that feeling. And you're always like, should I? Shouldn't I?
Yeah.
Like with the delete button or cutting things. So one of my friends said that he's got like, yeah, I really liked his book and everything. He doesn't want to be mentioned by name, but he was like, yeah, he goes, I have 20 copies, like literally 20 edited copies. And he's like, sometimes I'll just go back and I understand that because he had a character that he cut and then he used for something else. And I love that character. And I cut two characters but I liked them in their relationship. So I thought, oh, I'll just move them to something else. And so I definitely understand that feeling for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting to have 20 different copies.
Right?
Yeah,
I'm
and what
not joking. It might be like 23, but yeah,
that's crazy.
but he
I mean,
doesn't want to
like,
lose anything. I'm like, you can't just take notes, like, but he has to have
yeah,
a copy of it, like every change. And I'm like, that's like way past Scrivener, like
yeah.
I always tease him because I always send him the Charlie Day, where he's got all the dots and the maps and everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
'Cause
Yeah,
I'm
I don't think I don't have like that many separate drafts. I
yeah, yeah.
typically just modify my main draft and throw stuff in, the stuff I'm throwing out, I throw in folders without making it a whole draft living out there somewhere. But I mean, I have at least 30 plus drafts, revisions, whatever you want to call it, of Rise of the Mages in my back pocket. But as you were saying that, like describing your change from a rich constable to a completely different character, and changing the story, I had something similar. My book heavily features a school, so not super original, but I call it the Citadel in Rise
It's
of the Mages.
classic though. Like it's a classic trope, and that's what that was one of the things that drew me to it. I was like, oh, it's like the Jedi Academy almost, like or Harry Potter, whatever. Like it's a classic trope. There's a
Yeah.
reason we keep coming back to this. So to me, that pulled me in instantly. So I just want to throw that out there.
Well, I like to hear that. But I mean, it was for a few reasons, right? Like, um, one, I had just gotten out of my degree at college, and I kind of modeled it after a modern university.
Oh, that's cool.
Um, yeah, and I mean, like, you reading it, you probably won't necessarily see that right offhand, but like it's half engineering, tech and engineering, and half like military arts, because it's kind of a pre-industrial second world fantasy. So the symbolism there being, obviously engineering has a heavy corollary to universities today, anything STEM or what have you, really. But then we've kind of substituted any sort of formal military training, other than, I guess, our armed forces academies, which are awesome. but with sports, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
college sports. So I kind of tried to build some of those similarities into my school. Um, and it starts there. The story starts there. The two brothers that are most heavily featured in the story start at the Citadel, but the story is very much a, I call it a fantasy thriller, and I tried to structure it and write it like a thriller, like, a political thriller. Brad Thor is one of my favorite political thriller writers, even though I don't necessarily agree with his ideology anymore. um but along the way, I had a lot of thoughts of, should I make this a pure academy fantasy for the entire first book? Because I could slow it down, I could make it a very similar story, like everything else could stay the same, but I could just 100% make it academy fantasy. The whole book happens there, stays in that one setting, explore that a little more, and that was excruciating,
yeah,
because I think both worked. And it really just came down to, for me, what my purpose was with this book and with this series, and what I wanted it to turn into, and how it would best turn into something else. Turn into a trilogy that felt more epic. And so I decided to keep my fantasy thriller quest kind of, action adventure aspect, rather than rewrite it to all be at that Citadel. But yeah, I mean, there's so much of that stuff, man, that you just second guess yourself, and there's so much you could do. I think it just for me at least, it comes down to, what's my purpose? Let's write to it. And then if I have a purpose that's left unfulfilled, I'll do it in a few years.
yeah, yeah. It's so funny that you said that, like just said that, because like I saw this one painting that a friend of mine did on Instagram. And it was just absolutely amazing. It's like it's like this older, like probably like like middle age, like adventure, and he's just got like the coolest glowing electrical eyes, and like he just looked awesome. He's got some cool different glowing tattoos, and it gave me such a cool idea for this character. But I wanted to show it's up in like these like Himalayan mountains, and he ends up like basically like killing like villagers on accident, like defending like their village from these creatures. And all of a sudden, like everybody's like scared of him. And then I have like this guy coming in who I consider a lot like Raiden or whatever. That like comes in, like literally zaps in, and then like takes him off to this like same thing like academy. And I think that's where I've been stuck. Is I'm like, I don't know if I wanted to be a young adult academy kind of thing, or if like whatever. But it's just funny that you said that, because I so have that feeling because I'm the same way. I was like, okay, I'm gonna pause here because I can't figure out really what the rest of it is, but I'm gonna come back to it later. So I definitely understand that feeling, because my friend and I were discussing. It's like, because it is right. It is still fantasy, and the characters are still similar, but if you're at the academy, I think, versus the academy and then the world, I think I do feel it. My friend, he's like, well, there's gonna be all sorts of different political structures. There's gonna be, he's like, it's a completely different story. And that's where I got stuck. So I'm like, it is, I think personally, a completely different story that way. And there's different things that are expected of you, as the writer. The readers expect different things from character development. And yeah, I couldn't pick. So I was like, oh, I'm just gonna put a pin in it. But I applaud
Yeah.
you for being able to pick, because I couldn't. So
Well, I mean, yeah, along those lines, you're very involved in the education world, but I wanted, um, I wanted my book to be at least an option for people to recommend to, especially younger adults or younger, people who aren't into fantasy yet or aren't into reading yet, and something to get them into that. And so I felt like that academy school aspect might be
oh, for
appealing. It might
sure,
be,
for sure.
something familiar. But at the same time, I wanted to age it up a little bit and not be like a pure YA. And that's one of the reasons I decided to leave the Citadel, or the academy, right? during even just this first book, because I, was trying to give it a distinctly adult flavor, even though I was trying to make it, accessible
Yeah, yeah.
to a younger crowd, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. And I do think part of that too is just like theme wise is a good theme as an educator personally, because I got kids going like this year, after this year to the high school, and then like that's a
Right.
big scary place and it's different. Everything's different, and then I have kids that are, now juniors about to be seniors. I have kids that are seniors about to graduate and then go off to college. So I do think that that is a good move on your part, because I think that you'll get more people involved that way, like younger readers. So I definitely think that. And I just personally, I always do that too. Like I had a parent ask me about, my one of my books, and I said, well, I said, I do have violence and some things. I said, but I'm not a big swearer in my books. Like I'm a teacher, so it's like I feel like I always have to be careful, because my kids
Yeah.
would see my book and I'm like, I'm not doing any racy sex scenes or anything,
Yeah.
Maybe I allude to something, but like, but it's like I just don't do stuff like that, because I guess just personally, like I always like the Forgotten Realms, and like there was definitely violence, like people died, there was fighting, but there was some romance, but it was like there was never anything that my mom, had to worry about, me reading. And I was a higher level reader, so I started reading them in like early middle school, and I got to read other things. But it's like same thing with like Dragonlance too, I mean, I just feel like I just like that type of reading, and yeah, but I definitely like that though for what you're saying is like I just think personally like those are just great themes, and then I think you catch them in book one, and then you can do whatever in book two, and show them your wide world. And yeah, it sounds really cool though how you described it. It sounds awesome. So and I think that you make a good point though too, is like my friend had talked about, like, I can't remember where I saw, but he had sent it to me where I don't know if like hey, you described it or if it was Tor or what, but he was like, oh, like a thriller, like a fantasy thriller. And I had just got done talking to him and a couple other people on the podcast about that. Is like I do think that the best fantasy stories coming out today and sci-fi ones are ones that blur the lines and aren't just fantasy. Like I actually really like like the concept of like a fantasy mystery or a fantasy thriller, like you said. Like to me, that just sounds so much more exciting than just your typical. I hate to say typical because there's so many great fantasy stories out there, but I personally am more and more starting to like a blend of genres in fantasy. I just feel like it keeps my attention more and just makes it
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. I mean, that totally makes sense. And I think you can make anything work, Um, I think there are really good examples of great books, and great stories, that span an entire range of types or subgenres or whatever. There are even some that kind of defy categorization,
Yeah.
just because they don't necessarily, or at least the popular opinion is that they don't have much of a plot. You know, but they still work, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that was kind of where I was aiming. Is my attention is kept by books that have good pacing and that have a purpose, and in particular, have a character or set of characters moving toward a purpose and growing as individuals and as a group, right? And so I tried really, really hard to structure it to keep that moving, but to put in as much of the interesting fantasy trappings as possible, in the periphery and anywhere I could. And I think it worked. I don't, that's up to other people. It worked for me. That's up to readers to decide whether I did a good job or not. But you also run a risk, right? Because a lot of fantasy readers, especially today, they do enjoy fantasy for fantasy, and like there's a subgenre, I think, at least, that like gets as weird as possible and loves that weird stuff, and that's awesome. There's a subgenre that's very literary. There are other subgenres or subcategories that do a whole bunch of other things, and I don't think everybody's going to like my book because I picked a very specific format and a very specific structure, and I just had to be okay with that, you know?
I mean, I think that's a great point. Is like, like I had talked to my friend about that, and she said, I just talked to Jay Swift about that too. Actually, our second review's coming out this week. But her and I were discussing that, like trying to figure out sometimes where your audience is and where you're going it is scary. I think personally, because I think about that all the time. It's like because you are right. You're like setting off on a path, thinking that people are going to meet you there, and it's like it can be very, very scary at times because what if you're the one that shows up to the party? You're like, that's what you're always thinking as an author, and you spend so much time and energy, like you said, and on book one even, and you're just like, oh no, like, is this okay? Are the changes I've made okay? But yeah, I just personally think that's how. I mean, I've talked to so many people that have said the same thing, and have
Yep.
had a lot of success. But I think we're all. My friend made a good point. She was like, "Oh, it's like you're free falling almost, or like you go up into the plane and then all of a sudden you're coming back down, like that kind of feeling, and you don't really know if you are back on the ground until sales start going and then reviews and stuff like that." But I do have to tell you though, Scott, like I've seen. Oh man, I lost count this week. Had to have been like at least 30 of my friends on Twitter were sharing your book. Um, yeah, I had to have seen like at least 15, 20 people that I didn't know that were just randomly like sharing, review stuff like that, your cover. So it was about 50 people this week, and that's pretty up there for a week for me. I mean, obviously I'm all around the community and stuff, but still, that's a lot more than typical in one week. I might see like 3 weeks. Somebody I knew like had like maybe like 30 or something like that, but for one week, like that was pretty good. So I felt like you were making the rounds quite well in terms of the circles that I keep. So that was really cool. And I was telling people, I said, hey, he's going to be on podcast this week, so don't forget to check it out and then check out the socials and stuff like that for him. So, but yeah, that was really cool. So I
Well,
definitely
thanks.
think, I guess my point is, I feel like those people are out there. I saw
Yeah.
a lot of really good things. I don't know if you saw where I was trying to share it on Twitter. I was really slammed this week, so I probably forgot to tag you or they did. But yeah, I mean, it was really cool. So yeah, I definitely think that those people are out there. But yeah, as soon as I read the blurb, I was just like, oh, this is super cool. So yeah, it's definitely up my alley. So I'm really, really anxious to get my copy. So
I appreciate that, man, and
yeah,
because it's super hard to know.
yeah,
And yeah, I mean, if I'm not tagged, I might not see it.
yeah.
I try to hunt stuff down. I try to hunt mentions down when I can, but I don't think Twitter search works all that well. And
It
I
really doesn't. I try to find off. No, seriously, it does not. And I'm telling you, Scott, like when your name popped up, where a friend of mine shared, it was you and like 20 other authors, and I'm like, how have I not seen these people? I'm like, I'm on tour all the time, and I must have just missed you or something a couple of times, because it's a big company. But I'm like, I got irritated because I was like, I go through Twitter all the time to just search taglines for sci-fi, fantasy, whatever. And then, I had seen what you had posted on this book, Rise of the Mages, and I'm like, how did that not pop up in any of the searches that I did? You know what I mean? And because I'm
yeah,
constantly trying to follow people, I'm constantly trying to share stuff. I'm constantly trying to friend people on Facebook. I'm, just trying to, just to learn more and meet more people, see what people are doing. And I definitely feel like, Twitter and Facebook, I definitely feel like, and Instagram, I think ever since they changed the algorithms, like last spring to now, and now TikTok's really done the same thing. I just feel like it's been a lot harder to find people in our community. And I used to just put fantasy and then bam, all the people would pop up, and some of the friends you may know would pop up. Now they're trying to get me to follow people that like don't share our interests, or maybe they do a little, but they're not writers and authors, and like no offense to anybody. When I'm on Twitter, I consider Twitter my water cooler, like I want to talk to people like yourself, and like I mean I'll be friends with anybody or whatever, follow, but I just particularly go to to Twitter in particular to find more people like yourself, and I definitely feel like it's been a lot harder. So
yeah. I love Twitter and too much, especially if you ask my wife. But
that's
one of my big yeah, one of my big problems is that I have quite a few different interests that have very different crowds that all
Yeah.
happen to be on Twitter. So like tech Twitter, startup Twitter, finance Twitter, book Twitter, all those combined mean that I follow way too many people to keep up with. And so, yeah, I might miss things, but I mean, everything you're like, that's why I know many of my fellow authors so appreciate that you and people like you are taking the time to do podcasts like this, to review books, to do all this, because I think, I'm traditionally published, and I think people have this idea of traditionally published books that may not necessarily be accurate or as
It's not
accurate.
accurate. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not accurate. It's not. It's really not. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that. It's not accurate.
Well, and I'll tell you why and what I think. So even within traditionally published author catalogs, right? There's a very, very big difference between, now, obviously, this part's obvious. Everybody's going to know this, right? Between the big established names that have one way or another found an audience and people coming in fresh like me. But even still, there's a pretty wide range of attention that's given to any given debut, or mid-list, but any given debut. I'll stick with debut. And there are so many variables that aren't in my control or even in the publisher's control that end up dictating how the book's released, whether there are events or ads or anything like that around release. My book launched and then Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. So that was fantastic. Stuff like that happens. And then you can't really control when there's another big launch. So Tor, I launched with Tor on February 8th. And then just very recently, a much bigger debut launched. I think it's the Atlas 6 by, I don't know how to say their name. I'm
Oh,
horrible with pronouncing names. Olivie
I
Blake.
think I know. Yeah, I think so. I know what you mean. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's one of
Looks
those.
like a,
Yeah, some people you have to hear their name. I always ask you guys before the show because I
yeah,
messed up a few people, so I
it's,
definitely know that feeling. Yeah.
it's so hard, especially because I come from a very vanilla background, and I don't know always how to pronounce names. And yeah, when I see things in print, it's hard to know how exactly they're
Well, you're going off your experience. That's the thing. Is like
yeah.
I announce like basketball games and stuff for a district, and like I'm really bad at some of the names, and it's like like I've taught all over the country at this point, and I've
Yeah.
seen names from all over the world, but it's like you'll see the same name, and because of their background, that it's said differently, and it's like
Yes.
how are you
Yep.
supposed to know like 75 different alphabets? Like so, yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely understand that feeling.
Yeah. My wife makes fun of me because I lived in Brazil for 2 years.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I lived like primarily with Brazilians, so I got pretty good at Portuguese. Um, but my wife makes fun of me because if I see any foreign anything, I pronounce it like it would be pronounced in Portuguese, and she's like,
Yeah.
"Pretty sure that's not right." um, but anyway, my point is, not only is there going back to the traditionally published thing, not only is there like a big difference in how certain books are picked up and just much weirder variables than you would guess, I think, that affect budget and that kind of thing when something launches. You can't control world events and you can't control what comes out after you. Now that a much bigger debut than me has launched from my same publisher sort of, I mean, I think if I remember right, it's a pretty different story, but you know, uh, Tor's probably just not gonna be mentioning my book all that much until book two comes out. Um, so debut traditionally published, unless they're one of the fairly few that get like a lot of attention. Um, and many of them are well deserved, right? Like there are reasons that these things happen, but traditionally published authors who aren't one of those like major deals that they don't hand out all that often are a lot closer, I think, to being a self-published title
Oh, for sure.
than people think, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
No, it makes total sense. And I'm like blanking now because I just had so many interviews last couple weeks on who I was talking to. But this actually just came up. I was listening to old podcasts with Lindsay Baroker, Jeffrey Poole, and Joe Lalo, and I'm totally blanking on who it was. Forget her last name, but she was a really big like indie sci-fi author about 5 years ago, and it was Amy, and I forget her last name, but she made a good point. That because I believe she was originally traditionally published and then she went hybrid. But like she said the same thing is like she's like, I had to bring with me my platform, my social media. And I know for a fact that Kevin J. Anderson, very famous of Star Wars novels, that they have their Wordfire, press and everything. But he talks all the time about like wanting authors who not necessarily have a big platform, but who will do the work. And he talked about like there were a couple authors that used to be big, traditionally published, not like massive, but pretty big, like middle shelf, so to speak. And one person was like famous. She was famous for not wanting to do anything. She was on her Facebook saying like, "Oh, I don't want to do podcasts. I don't want to do this. I don't want to go to cons. I don't want to do anything." And he decided not to sign her because he's like, "Well, we'll have to do too much work to get her books out there." And
Yeah.
then he ended up signing somebody else who, I guarantee is going to sell less books than you, but because they, were all over their platform and were willing to do the grunt work or the groundwork, so to speak, like they signed him instead. So I definitely agree with you. And it's just interesting how you mentioned that today because I've listened to 3 or 4 other people talk about that on podcasts the last couple of days. Just with the last couple of weeks, the kind of stuff that's gone on. But yeah, I definitely think that people think that if you're traditionally published, you're like Stephen King right off the bat or Brandon
Yeah.
Sanderson. And it's like, I'm sorry, but like everybody just got eclipsed this week because of Brandon Sanderson's Kickstarter. Not saying there's anything, bad about that or whatever. I love Brandon. But it is what it is, right? And it's like, I think some people were freaking out because they're like, oh, well, that's our world for indie is the Kickstarter. But really, it's just anybody's world. But yeah, I definitely think that you need to have a platform, no matter who you are, and you need to bring people with you. And I know that sounds weird because most people think traditional publishing is something different. But yeah, today it's like, it's just so much different than it was 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, even pre-pandemic. And
Yep.
yeah, it's just
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah, that and or you have to be very willing to play a long game and play into the system, but yeah, there are so many people, especially people outside of publishing, that are like, oh man, you got a book deal and your book's out, like you made it. And I'm like, I made more money mowing lawns when I was 12 years old than I'm making from publishing, like it's not what you think.
Yep.
Um, unless you become one of those relative outliers. And
Yep.
and yeah, I mean, it just takes time. And I think building a platform is super helpful. This is super anecdotal. I'm not saying this is what people should go out and do, but I do think we are seeing more and more people get picked up on these bigger traditionally published deals who have gone into self-publishing and found an audience first.
Yeah. No, totally.
Yeah. So, and I mean, and if she ever listens to this, I'm so sorry if your name is not pronounced Olivia. I don't really know. But with this very same book, at the Atlas 6, she had quite a big following. I think Richard Swan, who just released The Justice of Kings, which I'm very excited to read. It's sitting
Yeah.
on my one of my TBR piles. Like you can see these piles here. I have a whole nother bookshelf just like this with piles over there. Um, I think he said he had like I don't remember how many books were in it, but he had a sci-fi series, at least one, right? That he self-published and then came in to write this fantasy series that sold to Orbit, and they're obviously very excited about it because they're putting a lot of weight behind it.
Yeah.
Um, they sent out a whole bunch of really cool special edition arcs and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And which is awesome because from everybody I've talked to that's read it says it's fantastic, and I'm super
Yeah.
excited about it. But yeah, it's a lot more nuanced than people think. And being traditionally published isn't like the silver bullet that's going to get you where you want to be. But at the same time, like, self-publishing super hard too, because there are so many good books out there,
Right. Yeah.
so finding an audience and building rapport with an audience, it's just hard.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I think even like I had talked to my wife and I talked to her constantly about this. I said, well, I just want you to know. I said, granted, it's going to be like I work extra, I do extra things because we don't have kids yet. To put money aside, for like 3 book covers, nicer ones, things like that. I said, well, I said, I'm gonna have to cover the cost for these things, but I said we might not get it back. Maybe we will one day, but it could be down the road. But yeah, I definitely think that, like I always talk to her about doing stuff like this. I say, I'm just hoping that, because I'm like, you just never know. I always say, like, you're one click away, we're one click away, like you're just one really good review away on one person's, podcast or website or whatever, where all of a sudden, like, everybody's like, oh, so and so reviewed this book, I'm going to go read it. And all of a sudden your sales are massive, and like, for instance, I just got like this stupid stupid um Star Wars meme, and I shared it on TikTok. Next thing I know, I got, like, it's still going, it's over 12,000 views, like 1,500 likes, and I'm like, okay, I'm trying to re-replicate it and I can't. But it's like, it's crazy to think about, where, like, if I share one thing about this interview or whatever, it's like all of a sudden people might be like, oh, 50 subscribers in, a day or something like that, like more subscribers. So I just think it's interesting though that, people again just think that, like, I don't think people understand how companies like Tor or Orbit work, where it's like you said, like, they only have so much time on their busy schedule to, to back your book, and you kind of have this window, right? And then they're going to move on to the next author, and particularly if that author, had a bigger following already, or is a book two, or as a perennial or something like that, they are going to back that one more, business wise. So I definitely think that people don't understand the business aspect. And I definitely want people to understand that, like, self-publishing is great. You got to eat all the costs, yeah, you get all the benefits, but at the same time, traditional publishers are not just going to give you, those crazy advances like they used to with $25,000, $50,000, whatever. Some of the crazy ones I heard from, like, just, I was talking to some older authors and stuff. I guess I should say older veteran authors, from 90s and 2000s. And they were like, yeah, man, the advances I used to get, they're like, some were like, I blew them. Other ones were like, I put them in the bank. And now a lot of them have become hybrid authors, which I found interesting. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think I think you have to decide, really, like, do the research and decide really what you want to do. But yeah, it is interesting to see those authors get poached, I would say, from the indie community, not in a bad way, but,
Yep.
like headhunted, I guess is a better way to put it, headhunted from the indie community and then published. Andy Ware is one of those, famous stories, Anthony Ryan, like, there's quite a few of them. So yeah, I definitely agree with you. It's definitely been interesting, the last 7 years, when I first met indie authors, and Brandon Sanderson, Patrick Rothfuss, Kevin Hearn. And then it was like, there was traditional on one end of this bookstore, and then there were indies on the other. Like, Michael J. Sullivan was there. Brian McCullen was there. It was just interesting to see where people's careers have ended up on both sides of the spectrum, both traditionally and indie published. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's just so circumstantial too, like,
It really
just with the process being the way it is, you typically, with an agent, you go on sub with however many good contacts your agent has. So I've seen a lot that go on initial sub, anywhere from 5 to 20 editors. And if it's a smaller group, obviously this reduces your chances of getting multiple people interested at once. But these editors are getting manuscripts from agents all the time,
Yeah, yeah.
all the time, and they don't pick up a lot of the agented manuscripts that come their way. They pass all the time. And so to get more than one that's not only interested, but interested at, two or more parties interested at the same time. That's how auctions happen. And they either preempt or bid up the amount of money they're going to pay in an advance, which then usually slides forward into a larger marketing budget, that kind of thing. And it really just has to do, you think about it, all the variables that go into whether 2 or more of 9 people who are slammed with way more work than they should be asked to do are going to not only read, but put together an internal campaign in their office and then put together an offer for this book at the same time. It's pretty crazy. So it's just a weird world, man. And more opaque, I think, than it needs to be. But I like giving this story and some of those details, at least, so that people understand kind of what they're up against. Or what they're signing up for, because I felt like I didn't know a ton of it before I got there. I'm happy with where I'm at and where my book is at. I'm happy that it's finally out in the market. But now I have to see. I just wait and see. Refresh Goodreads every day and see what happens.
Click, 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 click.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Yeah. It's just so funny because like there's so many circumstances recently where like I've seen somebody like I'm not going to mention their name, but like I've had them on the podcast, and I'll just say they have an amazing cover. They have an amazing fantasy book, and I don't know why there's sales. Like I personally like I'm about to pick it up really soon. It's going to be one of my first. I think it's going to be my first book. Because people always ask me to review, so I'm going to start to do reviews as well, like shorter ones, as often as I can. But like this person's book, I'm like so excited for, and it's right up my alley. And I'm just kind of like looking around, like, is everybody else paying attention, to this great book? And I read a little bit of it so far, like the first 50 pages. It had me right away. It's just a longer book, so I've had to, move it around in the TBR. But I'm so confused at why it has not just skyrocketed. And, and I talked to that author, and I'm like, listen, I'm like, maybe it's going to take your book 2 or your book 3. But at some point, like I've seen so many books in the market for years, decades. And I'm like, I feel like you're going to just skyrocket, and I'm like, I don't know what everybody's problem is. I said, it could just be the time, like you're saying, right? Like there's crazy stuff that's gone on the last, 2 years. Crazier than I would have thought as a history teacher. But yeah, I think you can only plan for so many variables. I write down notes for my, I'm going indie, so it's like book launch. I've talked to a lot of people, I'm trying to put together the best campaign for next year. And it's like, I just know though, no matter what I do, even with a rapid release schedule, even with, I'm going to have 4 other books, in the wings ready to go to, finish up. So I have 7 out there within like 13 months once the first one's published. I still have to be ready to know, right, that I could just crash and burn, and it's just going to be a slow burn, and I just don't think a lot of people prepare themselves in the right way. I'm not saying they're not going to be successful, but I just feel like you have to pay your dues. Like I'm in that point in teaching now where like people trust me, I am experienced. I've been doing all these other things for years. And now people just leave me alone, and the kids are having a great time. I'm having a great time. It's taken me a while to get there, but and now I'm starting, I'm just coming home happy. I'm able to write better, and I just think it's taken me a while to get there. And I think on average, you have to just give yourself that time, I guess, to adjust. And, it is a slow simmer. And I think if people are more prepared for that, whether they're indie or traditional, no matter what you prepare for. I like to do podcasts, talk to people like yourself. I will share anything for any author. If anybody ever wants to come on, you want to come on anytime, talk about whatever. If we got to do 100 podcasts together to get people to buy more books, like I'm totally okay with that. But I just think a lot of people are thinking it's just going to be instantaneous, and all you have to do is write the book and put it out there. And I just want them to know it takes a lot more than that, no matter which market you're in. So
yeah, I think your slow burn comment is right on. And it could be that it's a slow burn with any given book, but it could be a slow burn on your career. There are plenty of authors who have books that did well and books that didn't do so well. You never know which is going to hit and why, and what's going to happen. So yeah, totally right with you.
Well, if you look at like The Alchemist, right? That's one of the best books I've ever read, and I'm not even a big fiction person. I mean, I read classics and different things just to learn and to get a good story. But that book was like life changing for me, and it took me years to read it. But like that book sat on the shelves for like 13 years, like 12, 13 years, and then it took Bill Clinton to read it to then all of a sudden, bam, sold like a million copies. And it's done even better now. It's like, I don't know, people don't want to hear that, but like, George R. R. Martin too, like, he wasn't this huge monolith. Was, really pretty successful, but not really successful before Game of Thrones. J.K. Rowling, is another one of those who, took a long time, so I just think if you, we teach kids in history all the time that, all the people that we talk about in history, every single one of them, we talk about them because they came up against some sort of obstacle and they figure out a way to get around the obstacle. And I
Yeah.
think if you're going to be an author in this day and age, there are a lot of things that we have that we haven't, other authors in the past haven't. I think you have a lot more weapons, particularly social media at your disposal. But it's like I told the kids, we were talking the other day about social media, and same thing with a hand axe. Hand axe can be a weapon or a tool depending on how you're using it. And we talked about social media that way too. And I think it, has a huge part to play in how you're using it as an author. Again, no matter which community you're in. And I think that if you, again, the slow burn, like if you're just doing things, I hear a couple people say doing things. I like to do things in, like a measured and maneuverable fashion. And that's where I'm like trying to do specific things a lot on purpose. I like to be purposeful about it rather than just throw energy out there because I feel like otherwise I might as well, like if I don't get a good conversation out of a podcast with people over and over again, what's the point in doing it? Like I might as well spend more time writing or, on social media and try to do something. But I found that this has helped me personally out a lot. And I've been able to help other people out a lot. And, I've had a lot of people private message me like, hey, I really liked your interview with Scott. I'd love to, I checked out the rest of them. And, a lot of them are writers and I love that they get to hear what you guys have to say. So I consider it successful. But I think that, people do have to, in this day and age, I think you have to be careful with your time and you do need to find something, but I think you need to find something to do that fits you. I really enjoy talking to people like yourself. I could talk to you about writing all day or just your books or your characters. So that's what I do. So I definitely think it's important to figure out what you enjoy doing to help you and other people within the community.
Yeah, totally. And I think the other side of the coin too, though, is like sometimes it can be hard to build an
Yeah.
audience before you have accomplished something, like, and I don't know. One of the reasons I decided to go with traditional publishing is because I wasn't as comfortable with marketing myself, I guess. I find that a little more difficult than some, I think. And so I wanted not just the help there and kind of, the coattails to ride. But, I liked the idea, I guess, of the legitimacy, but that might come with that. But at the same time, man, like there are, like we've talked about, there are so many uh people who are getting the right attention because their book is good and because they put, like you're talking about, the right effort in. Thiago Abdallah, his book recently came out. He's doing a great job getting it out there. Ryan, and I don't know how to pronounce his last name either. Cahill, I don't really
I
know.
thought it was Cahill. Sorry, Ryan, if we messed it up.
Yeah, and I mean like Zach Argyle, and I'm sure I'm missing a ton, but there are a lot of people kind of giving a good blueprint of how to be, at least in my opinion, at least as successful as a debut traditional
Yeah.
author as an indie. And like you mentioned, you have a lot more freedom. You can take stuff to market a lot faster, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's an interesting world that I don't think a lot of people dive deep enough to care about, but it's fun. This is why I like doing these kinds of things, podcasts, or even just back and forth on Twitter, because it's fun to find people who care about the same kinds of things,
Oh,
because
for sure.
most people don't.
Yeah. Well, I just thought it was funny because oh my gosh, I just listened to a podcast. Um, his name's Jeff, okay? And he wrote the Arsenal series, which is a superhero series that just looks amazing. It's like his main character, I believe. Sorry, Jeff, don't hit me for this wrong mistake, but I believe his character like got in an accident or something like that. But anyways, so she's in a wheelchair. Well, she creates like essentially like this Iron Man type suit that lets her become the superhero Arsenal. And Jeff was on Lindsey Broker's podcast like years ago, and I was listening to an older one, but he was like, yeah, my wife takes me to a party and she's in the car and treats you like a child. And it's like, okay, nobody in here wants to listen to you talk about your books anymore. Like, you could talk about it like for 5 minutes and then you have to stop, because he was like, I just want to talk about it the whole time. So I said to my wife, we were driving back recently, and she goes, that's a guy who you should have on your podcast. And I was like, what are you trying to say? Like, you're trying to like, like babysit me, like have somebody else babysit me for an hour. But yeah, she was like, no, like that's what you do all the time. And I was like, I laughed so hard because I was like, I felt bad because I could think of 3 parties we went to before the pandemic, holiday parties where like I was almost done with my first draft and I was so excited. And I just kept talking to people about it, and like nobody wanted to hear about it after that. So I totally feel you. It's definitely nicer when it's like education too. When I can find somebody who's an educator, like I want to talk to them. Like if I can find a martial artist to talk to, I'll talk to them all day long, and it's the same thing with writing. I think you have to, birds of a feather flock together, so I think it's important to talk to people, in that community that, whatever you like to do. So.
What martial arts do you do?
Oh, well, because of the pandemic, I'm just doing Washington karate right now. We're doing it outside. I'm hoping, because of what our numbers look like here in Central New York, I'm hoping against hope that this summer I could go back to jujitsu. I have a thyroid condition, so it's very down there on the list for autoimmune disorders. But because of how things have been, it's like they don't. Every time I ask my doctor about taking off the mask, they're like, everybody else is fine. You should still keep yours on, even though you have the booster, because we don't know what's going to happen. And I'm like, okay. So my wife's like, we're trying to find like a more comfortable one that I can wear while doing jujitsu again. But I would like to go back to jujitsu and judo. I was doing those for about 5 years.
Oh,
Then I had
wow.
like grad school and stuff. I'm a
Yeah.
second degree black belt in taekwondo. I just kind of just needed a break, so I was doing some other stuff. But yeah, I'm like I got my brown belt, so I'm like 2 brown belts away before black belt for wash and roof. So I'm hoping to finish up before we have some kids, and that way I can come home after for a little bit and not have to worry so much about what's going on up there and memorizing everything. But yeah, it's been
Yeah,
fun.
that's amazing. That's really cool. Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to necessarily go down this rabbit hole, but I'm being extra careful about COVID as well, especially with, trying to protect my daughter as much as possible.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we're homeschooling her for that reason. And this was supposed to be my time. We moved out to Massachusetts in 2019, and I kind of for a really awesome job my wife was taking, and I decided to quit my corporate career for a while to work on writing. And it was supposed to be my time to get back into jujitsu and a few
Oh,
other
nice.
things as well. But that did not pan out, because just a few months later, the pandemic hit and we decided to homeschool our daughter. So that's been my adventure for the last few years, trying to juggle homeschooling my daughter and being, the primary parent while my wife works and writing and whatever else. But yeah, I did it. It wasn't, I don't know what you'd even call it. It wasn't a formal belt giving kind of situation, but
Oh,
I did, I think 3 years, 2.5 years, 3 years of jujitsu classes
oh
when I
wow.
was in college. Yeah, basically just this guy, super cool guy. But he was doing jujitsu, like, in a legit gym where they
Yeah,
give
yeah,
belts and everything. But then he would come and I don't remember what belt he was, whether it was like purple or brown at that point. but he would come and teach all of us beginners everything he was learning in his gym, and it was super fun. So I just kept taking the course through
Yeah,
basically as long as I was at college.
yeah.
But I freaking loved it, man. I love jujitsu, and I got into watching MMA and a whole bunch of stuff like that. And I think a little bit of that comes through in my books, but obviously I'm no actual martial artist like you. And man, there's another one. I'm forgetting his name. I want to say it's Alex something.
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't know why I can't do last names today.
I
Sorry,
know, man.
you're watching this. But yeah, his
Yeah.
books are combat codes.
Yeah. The combat
That's
codes.
super
So
cool. Yeah,
yeah,
he's a
he
black
lives.
belt, I believe. I think he just got his black belt last year. Yeah, because yeah, like that was really cool that I saw that. Yeah, because I
Yeah,
didn't know that until I started following him on Instagram, and I was like, oh, that's really cool.
I can't remember what his level is or whatever, and I don't know what the levels mean anyway. But I remember thinking it was super legit. And
Yeah,
I live in Massachusetts, so I think he's pretty close here. I think he's like on the south or maybe west end of
I think so. Yeah,
west,
yeah.
yeah, west side of Boston, and I'm up in the north side of
Oh, okay.
Boston.
But I say he goes to a
Um,
really good gym too, over there. I forget its name, but like I looked it up one day because I was bored, and I was like, I remember my friends talking about that. I was like, that's a pretty cool spot over there. That's on one of my lists when we travel. Because we were supposed to go to Boston last year, then like our numbers here went up. And then because of school, it was like kind of vague on what we were allowed to do or not.
yeah,
And I was like,
yeah,
well, I want to come back with COVID because then I would have had to, I think I would have had to eat like 4 days out of my own sick days or something because they only give you like 10 days. Um,
rough.
yeah, so I was just like, I don't want to do that. And I had
Yep.
some students where like they just can't even get the flu because like they had some parents with like terminal illnesses and stuff like that. So we were
Yep.
like, we're just not going to travel. But yeah, I was supposed to go to Boston and actually go to his gym. And I was like, maybe
Yeah.
I'll see him there and just be like, hey, can you sign this book? Because I got book one like all ready to go. But yeah, it's hard though, right? Because it's like I talked to my wife about it and because she's like, well, you want to go back? And I was like, it's just so hard because it's like you just I don't know. And it's hard for me too to go back during school because I always get a black eye. And then, like, it just always makes me look like, like, oh, Mr. Kubal's so violent. It's like,
Yeah.
it's just like I'm always rolling with somebody, and it's either it doesn't matter if it's a white belt to brown belt, like somebody always gets me. I was actually just talking about that at karate today because the instructor showed something and then kind of got my eye a bit, and I was teasing her. I was like, "Yeah, my wife sent me to karate because she thought it was safe."
That's
But yeah,
funny.
yeah, jujitsu's awesome though. I mean, I really love doing judo and jujitsu at the same time. My friends are always asking me like, "Why don't you write about it?" And I'm like, "Well, the problem is then I get too technical, and I feel like nobody really wants to read it." So I am
Yep.
actually really interested to read Alex's book, to see how he dealt with the martial arts in particular. Because I would like to do a monk thing at some point. I think that would be really cool. Try and put that knowledge to use. I mean, I definitely do it for like, like archery. I'm big into archery. Obviously, I got to teach history. I'm really big into military history, so I use a lot of that. But like sword and shield, like I was learning for a little bit in college with somebody, the katana, different stuff like that. Like I do a lot of weapons training and put it into the books, but martial arts, I feel like sometimes is a little harder because, like I said, you can't say, "Oh, I point the hand here and did this," and it's like I applaud people that are really good at it. I mean, R.A. Salvatore is one of those where I'll read any of his fight scenes any day of the week, and I feel like most of the books, just have amazing ones. But I'm not that good at it yet, so maybe one day. But yeah, that's
Yeah,
super cool. Yeah, I
I'm a
didn't know
bit.
that, so that's
Yeah,
awesome. Yeah, when I come your
I'm.
way, we'll have to try and meet up and we'll go outside and do it or something. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mention it that much because it's very amateur, and college was, God, 10, 12, 13 years ago now. So I haven't done it for a long time. I got caught up in working a lot
Yeah.
in my corporate career and then had a kid. And, my wife and I played soccer together. That was kind of our thing for a long time. So that ate up most of my time.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, I've been meaning to get back into it. But yeah, I like I like you're talking about. There are certain people that are way more qualified to get into actual martial arts. I haven't even tried to do sword training, sword and shield. other than just making sure I understand the basics. But I'm a really big fan of how people like, and whether it's accurate or not, uh, I'm a big fan of how Bernard Cornwell handles
Oh yeah,
his, sword and shield type battles. And I tried to take a lot from not just him, but people in that same vein of focusing a lot on what's going on individually, but also trying to keep a good
yeah,
view of what's happening tactically and with different groups. Yeah, it's fun. And I'm not a huge expert with archery or anything either, other than I just have hunted a decent amount in the last 10 years. I like to hunt, and went from rifle to archery, which is a big shift.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
And not necessarily super applicable to battle scenes, but at least the basic mechanics of how things work, and
yeah,
how bad it hurts if you slap the inside of your wrist with a longbow. you know
yeah, yeah. Or have an arrow break on your. Yeah, I had that happen. Like I had a nice gash, and I was like, "Oh," my dad's like, "Oh, you're gonna need stitches." I'm like, "No, I'm just gonna." And I actually don't even have a scar anymore. But yeah, I was definitely for sure. I had a friend who had a bowstring snap on him so bad that he did have to have stitches. Actually, like it
Oof.
was pretty crazy. And I had a friend had that happen at one of the reenactments. I can't remember what they were doing, like how they did it, but it was like safe for them. He goes, yeah, he goes, everybody I shot the dull arrows or however they blunted them. He goes, they were safer than me shooting them. Like he like
Funny.
sent me the pictures. I was like, oh, that looks ghastly. And I had
Ooh.
never heard of it before. So I was teasing my buddy because there was one video game we were playing at the time where I think it was like Boulder's Gate or Icewind Dale, where it's like, you use the regular items too much and they broke on you in the middle of combat. So I was teasing him. I was like, yeah, I was like, you have to update to the newest Boulder's Gate version. You can't use the original one. He was like, shut
That's
up.
funny.
Yeah, it was
That's really
pretty
funny.
insane. But yeah, it's cool
Yeah.
because I talked to a lot of those the SCA guys and gals about different stuff. I was supposed to go join one of those groups, and then the pandemic happened. I was supposed to go do fencing actually
Oh,
with the
cool.
traditional French rapier, and they closed down, and now they're still only doing stuff online. So I'm hoping that now that like our area has calmed down quite a bit here in central New York. I'm hoping that they bring that back because to me that would be really cool. I have this one changeling that I would love to do in like a French Renaissance type of fantasy setting. And I feel like he'd be really good at like the fencing and stuff. So it'd be cool to get that kind of thing. I feel like
Yeah.
like Miles Cameron's one of those people who
Yep.
does such a good job with it, and it's always exciting. And the writing fighting. If you guys haven't seen writing fighting yet, make sure you check it out. Miles has this great YouTube channel on it for people that write fighting scenes. But yeah, I got really into it. I was like looking
Yeah.
at all these things, and yeah, it's cool when you can take those kinds of things and apply it really well in your writing. I don't think I'm there yet, but I hope to be where one day. But
Yeah, writing fighting is actually a really good example of resources I use,
yeah,
stuff like that, because even if it's just understanding the basics of movement, or what certain weapons sound like when they
yeah,
hit things, or what an arrow flying through the air near you sounds like, that kind of stuff, I think can make a pretty big difference in immersing a reader in your world.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, like Peter McLean, like Priest of Bones author, like he was just on the Wizard Words and Words podcast, and he was saying how you never say shoot a bow, it's release an arrow. And I'm like, oh man, I was like, I don't think I've done that yet, but I'm about to like have archery in my books. And I was like, oh, that's a good point. Cause he's like, nobody said that historically until firearms were created. And I was like, oh, that's actually a good point. So I've like been meaning to, when I go through the next couple of chapters, like I have one I'm starting to finish tonight where I do have somebody who's releasing arrows. So I have to be really careful about saying shooting. But I do know people that drives them nuts. Like, like me in particular, when I'm trying to do this historical fantasy, I feel like it's like what you said earlier, like, we were talking, you really got to be careful of what you're doing with certain audiences because they expect certain things. So I was like,
Yeah.
if I'm gonna go historical fantasy, I'm actually gonna have like like somebody edit it who's done Roman history and stuff from that time period. just
Yeah.
to read through. And I don't even mind paying them because I just feel like, my friend does that for science fiction. He's not very sciencey, but he likes he loves science fiction. So he does more of like a Star Wars science fiction, like fantasy, sci-fi kind of thing, or fantasy with sci-fi elements. But yeah, he just pays somebody like a college professor that he knows. I forget, I think he's mechanical engineering and something else like physics or something like that, or quantum physics. And he just pays them, and then they just go through, they read the book, he gives them a free copy once it's done later, and he pays them and like $250. And he gets the perspective from somebody like that, because it's hard sci-fi, and obviously you have to do hard sci-fi for the hard sci-fi crowd. But yeah.
I do think that's a good idea. However, I have seen quite a few very successful books that obviously haven't done that.
Oh, for
They use
sure. Oh, for
they
sure.
use inertial dampeners instead of damper,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that kind of thing. And you mentioned arrows. I'm actually trying to think back. I know that I had, I had to fight to edit out all mention of firing a crossbow. I have a lot of
Well, it's
crossbows,
a fantasy
more than
setting.
yeah,
Like,
more
yeah.
than longbows. It's crossbows in my book. But I had to, like you mentioned, change to release. And I'm actually not a super opposed to the word shoot or shot with
Yeah,
respect
yeah,
to a
yeah.
crossbow or even a longbow. And
Aiming,
I,
but you're still shooting it. Like it's still a trigger, like
yeah,
a
in
trigger
my opinion,
mechanism.
it's a good descriptor of what the projectile is doing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
At least in current language. I'll have to go back. I'll have to read my own book to remember to remember whether I said shoot or shot.
I don't think I've never heard of that before. I just was like thinking about it. So I was like, oh, like not for like a fantasy setting, but like for historical fantasy. Cause I have a couple of them. I was like, oh, maybe I should think about it there. Cause I do have crossbows too. So I'm like, well, or am I okay? Because I still think like if you had crossbows, I personally feel like it'd still be the same vernacular, cause you're
Yeah.
shooting it,
Fire
you're firing.
Fire's the one.
Yeah,
Fire's the one that I was like, that cannot ever be in my books, because I
that's
see that,
fair.
in movies or in anything where they've got bows. They obviously haven't invented any black powder
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
weapons yet. And they're saying fire, and it's like, no, not
I
fire.
It's so funny when you say that, because I guess like when I watched like Dragonheart, I think is with Dennis Quaid, I think they say it there, but like they use fire arrows. So I guess
That could work.
I always assume that, but I remember I did read one person's where they basically explained it to the reader as like this culture uses, like they usually fire arrows that are on fire, so they say fire.
See, there's always a caveat. Yep.
Yeah. I just do think it's funny though that you have to be careful of, which subgenre you're, and I'm like, I don't care. Particularly in sci-fi, I'm like, I just don't care. I'm like, give me good characters, give me some cool tech, maybe throw an ancient civilization in there every once in a while. And I'm like, let's call it a day. I'm like,
Yeah.
one of my friends was complaining about something like that, and it wasn't Star Wars. Let's just say it was. And I was like, dude, I was like, there's like furry Bigfoot creatures firing crossbows. Sorry, shooting. And I guess there would be firing, right? Yeah, and I was like, these people control the force, like, they have light swords. And I was just like trying to fumble it just to make it funny. But yeah, I was like trying to explain to him, I was like, what's the difference of this tiny little thing you're saying versus, I was like, you can't, your suspension of belief is so great that you have Bigfoot shooting a crossbow, but you can't believe this little sciencey thing is different in this galaxy, or that they
Yeah.
at least say it differently. I'm
Yeah.
like, I got way too much going on in my life to worry about those little things, I guess. But it is kind of funny how I've heard that from a few people from different subgenres. They're like, yeah, be careful about X, Y, and Z. So
Yeah, it is a conundrum, because I am a firm believer in, like, it's a secondary world. So things are going to be different, right? But at the same time, I pay very close attention to all of those kinds of details, and they bug me a lot. I'd say in my own work more than other people's work. But yeah, whether the conclusion I arrive at is the same that each reader is going to arrive at is another question.
yeah, yeah. Well, the book I just did it, like, for instance, the book my friend was complaining about had like, I just was like, oh, I'm just gonna mess with them and see how many like reviews it had. like I think Goodreads alone was like 15,000. And so I
Jeez.
sent just the reviews back to him, and I was like, "Yeah," I said, "I think you're part of the the minority here, buddy." And I was like, "There's so many people, right, that read the book and never review it." Which everybody in the audience, make sure you're not one of those people. Like, please review books because
Authors appreciate it.
yeah,
Yep.
everybody here like lives off of them. So
Yeah. Yep.
that's how I find a lot of books that I want to read and stuff. Is just that kind of thing. It's like
Me
somebody's
too.
review, but yeah. And I'm
Yep.
like, it takes 5 seconds on Goodreads, especially, and it's like,
Yeah.
even if you just said a couple of words like, "Oh, I really enjoyed it," and just like tell why. I do that a lot on Audible too, because for a while I wasn't reviewing Audible books, and then I was talking to, I'm actually having Christopher G. Brenning on
Mhm.
tomorrow again for the second time because he's gonna showcase some art for book two, which we're both really excited about. Book one was amazing, it's the Hellborn King. But we were just talking about that, and it was just like one of those things where, yeah, it was kind of funny that some people don't seem to understand like those kind of concepts with reviewing books. But
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely think it's really important personally. But,
Amen.
all right. Well, I know we didn't get to a lot of the questions, but I just figured we could save
That's
them
all right.
for next time that we talk. But I felt like you like brought up a lot of really good stuff that I just personally want to talk about. And it's always funny when somebody like yourself mentions it the exact week that, I find out the same thing or listen to a podcast or something, or somebody mentions it on Twitter. It's really funny how that works out. It's almost like it's fated or something like that. But do you want to, just as like a closing, do you want to just, I know you talked a little bit about your book. Do you want to give us just like a little snippet, like a little advertisement, if you will, if you like had to sell your book in one sentence or two sentences, what would you say? Whatever. But what is your book, Rise of the Mages, about, just for our audience?
Yeah, sure. And I did describe a little bit of what the story's about. Two brothers at an academy called the Citadel. The Citadel is attacked by a political leader from a neighboring province, and one brother has to rescue the other. I very purposefully made it a fantasy thriller in terms of how it reads and the pacing. But I also worked in as much of my interests in engineering and technology, as well as how a magic might work if it were somewhat plausible, given some liberties with electromagnetism. How would magic work, and how would it intertwine with technology if that were the case? And so, yeah, that's it. I think people who appreciate a fast-paced fantasy novel, like a Red Rising, although that's a sci-fi, or even Bernard Cornwell, like we talked about. Those are some of the faster, more military type books that I tried to marry to a traditional fantasy setting or feel like a Robert Jordan or a David Eddings that I grew up reading.
Oh, I love
So
David Things.
yeah,
Great
yeah,
book right there. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
that's really cool. Yeah. Yeah, David's one of my like favorites. Like, I mean, I think now you can be like, oh, like these things should have been changed, but in terms of like the core group of characters, it was I just like Pellegra was like, I still think is one of the coolest. I think her and Moraine are on the same level personally.
Yeah,
But
yep.
yeah, Silk's one of my favorite characters of all time. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I have since learned that Eddings is a little bit of a problematic person in his personal life, but The Pawn of Prophecy was the first fantasy book I ever read, and the book that
Oh,
really got me into
wow.
reading. So,
Wow.
I have a I have a pretty soft spot in my heart for that series.
Yeah.
And The Wheel of Time is the series that I read over and over and over growing up, because every time a book came out, I would just reread the series. So that was a big deal to me growing up. So
Yeah.
yeah, I would agree with you. Paul Guerra and Moiraine were some pretty fantastic idols, I guess, or to grow up reading about.
Yeah. Well, like Bulgarian too. Like like I just think that I was talking to my buddy about this. I said, like everybody always loves the anti-hero now. I said, I still love your Chuck Norris's, your Walker Texas Rangers, your Bulgarians. I said, especially in our world today, I feel like that you know, like, yeah, they might be, I think it's still important to show that they're fallible. And I feel like Belgarian's one of those characters that was, you know, like sometimes he gets angry, sometimes like, you know, he messes up that one time where he creates these storms that ruin all this whole area, you know, and then Pulgera and totally blanking on his grandpa's name.
Belgrath.
Yeah, thank you. Belgrath have to fix it, but I do like his intentions were pure, and I do personally still really enjoy those paladin like type characters. Whether or not they have flaws or not, but sometimes I just get so over the anti-hero now. I'm like, let's get a real hero back, you know, like give me a
Yeah.
Bulgarian, you know, somebody
Yep.
trying to do the right thing and effing up along the way, but still trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yep.
yeah, totally.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's absolutely what I tried to do. And I think it can be more than just a trope, right? I think that
Yeah.
that hits people for a reason. People want to have reason to believe that they're capable of special things, you know. And I think people are, and I think people vastly underestimate themselves. So I think there's a lot of value to that kind of a story. But yeah, just so people don't get the wrong idea, uh, my story is that for sure a hero story. However, there is probably a little more messing up along the way than a you know, those old school traditional fantasies.
Well, it's a book one, you know, like you got to mess up.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Yeah.
there'd be no other
Yep.
books after.
Amen. Yep.
My friend the other day, she goes, I think I'd have like 16 books right now.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah.
She goes, I'm more of a Harry Dresden by far. And I was like,
There you
good
go.
way to put it. Like, trying to do the, she's like, or an Atticus from like Kevin Hearn's world. I was just like, I laughed so hard because I knew exactly what she was talking about. And I was like, yep. I said, I'd probably be in the 20s or 30s by now, you know. I don't know who that would be author wise or character wise, but yeah,
I
definitely.
like that way of thinking about it. That's funny. I
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. That's awesome. All right, Scott. Well, thank you so much. Do you have any other news or updates or anything like that that you'd like to share? Obviously, book one, Rise of the Mages, is currently out, and people should go and buy it as soon as they get done. Maybe right now, actually, even before we're done with the podcast. But anything else you want to share with us right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's mostly it, man. The Rise of the Mages just came out less than a month ago, so that's what's big on my mind. And I've got book 2 in revisions, hopefully ready to go sometime next year. So yeah, shouldn't have to wait too long for the continuation.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, like I said, you know, good luck with book one. If there's anything else, you know, that I can do or, you know, that we can do as a podcast, you know, to help you out, tag me in anything you want and I'll share it. Sometimes I miss things because of my current schedule, especially like I said, coaching starting. So tag me if you want, you know, something to be shared and I'll plaster it all over the internet as much as I can. My 2 Twitter accounts and everything else. Yeah, but you know, again, good luck. I really appreciate you coming on today. It's great talking with you. Like I said, hopefully we can get you on, you know, again real soon, if you know, not by yourself with a panel or something like that, and you know,
Cool.
discuss some more things. Maybe I was thinking about doing a Wheel of Time panel, so if you're down for that, that'd be
Love it. I
awesome.
love the Wheel of Time. Yep.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I'll put you down for that, and I will be sending out emails within the next month or so for those panels. So I look forward to
Cool.
getting you on again really soon. Then.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, man. This
Yeah,
was a
yeah.
really good time.
Yeah, anytime, anytime. All right, my friend. Well, Scott, you have a great rest of the day and we will talk to you later, okay?
Okay. See you, brother.
Have a good one.